Being one of the greatest disasters in human history, the Black Death or Plague is full of interesting facts that many people don't know. From odd treatments to theories about where the disease came from, this event in the mid-14th century was shockingly interesting. While some of these details can make you giggle, others are simply devastating. It's a shame we were never taught them in high school history classes. Well, don't worry about that, because today we shall have a look at 15 shocking facts you didn't know about the Black Death. Get ready to learn some great Black Death facts that will for sure have you looking like a history expert anytime the topic comes up. Welcome to Untold History Guy, where you can find fun, fascinating, and sometimes shocking chronicles of history. Join us as we journey back and uncover the untold truths of the past. Number 1. It reduced the world population by 100 million. The Black Death didn't get its name by chance. This was a killer plague for the books. About 25 to 60% of Europe's population was wiped out, with over 75 million people dying across Europe over just a few years. The mortality rate for this disease was set at 50 to 70%, and it was so bad that daily hundreds of bodies would form human landfills. The damage was so devastating that the world population didn't recover for several centuries. Number 2. The plague evolved from China. When people think of the Black Death, most envision Europe. But did you know that's not where it originated from? Modern scientists have compared 17 complete sequences of plague genomes and traced the history of the disease as well as how it spread. Their findings have revealed that the Black Death possibly evolved from China 2,000 years ago. It's mighty interesting. Considering we're currently facing a global pandemic with similar roots, what do you think? 3. The Black Death was not the first plague. Although the Black Death of the 14th century is the most famous and fatal, it was not the first occurrence of the disease. One other outbreak occurred in the 6th century and is known as Justinian's Plague of the Middle Ages. This was also a tragic calamity with tens of millions of deaths, but somehow it got lost in the history vortex because of its more aggressive brother. Surely some of you can relate to the feeling of living in your brother's shadow. Number 4. People thought the Black Death was spiritual punishment. Since medical and scientific research was not advanced at the time, all types of theories came up to try to explain the Black Death. No one knew that the disease was actually caused by bacteria carried by rodents and fleas. One theory was that it was a show of God's wrath. They thought it was some sort of divine judgment. Prayer and appeasing God were, therefore, the most logical cure that millions flocked to. Others assumed the devil was behind the plague. Number 5. William Shakespeare lived through the Black Death. William Shakespeare and the Black Death seem to be from different eras in history, but on the contrary, the famous poet lived in Elizabethan times. He witnessed the rampage firsthand and even, unfortunately, lost 3 sisters and 2 brothers to the plague. Later in life, he also lost his son and grandson in the same way. It's so heartbreaking. The sadness and fear caused by the Black Death ended up pushing Shakespeare to look for an outlet. That led him to poetry, from which he enjoyed great success and became one of the best playwriters of all time. Talk about turning lemons into lemonade. Number 6. The plague's odd treatment methods. As you can imagine, the Black Death caused complete pandemonium. People were scrambling for solutions and even got desperate. So much so that they resorted to weird, crazy, and even disgusting treatments. For example, stool and urine were used as some sort of aromatherapy. The reasoning was that bad odors would drive the illness away. If that isn't desperation, I don't know what is. Other cures included bloodletting, potions, and even the use of animal parts. Little did they know that antibiotics, cleanliness, and quarantining were the answers they were looking for. Number 7. The Black Death caused an economic collapse. With a dwindling population, Europe faced a lot of setbacks, especially economically. Healthy working peasants were dying in large numbers, so the field's labor supply was nearly non-existent. Noble families also died off because this disease did not discriminate. Additionally, traditional practices and knowledge were lost during this time. All these factors combined caused enormous economic distress. Some leaders, such as King Edward III, tried to come up with laws that could counter this. For example, he passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. which made it compulsory for any healthy person under 60 to work, otherwise they were fined. That just shows how devastating the Black Death was. Number 8. Nostradamus was one of the first plague doctors. While it's clear that the medical assistance of this time was greatly lacking, one gentleman, known as Nostradamus, helped revolutionize the treatment and care for the disease. He began his journey as a plague doctor at the tender age of 15. We can say desperate times call for desperate measures. While other doctors came up with techniques that either didn't work or exasperated the disease, Nostradamus emphasized cleanliness, which was the solution. He also ensured the proper disposal of infected bodies to prevent the spread of the disease. Number 9. The plague traveled by ship. Another interesting fact about the Black Death is that the disease was a joyrider, or better yet, a stowaway. As merchant ships docked from port to port all over Europe, no one was aware that they carried unwanted passengers. Infected fleas were transported from country to country aboard the ships on cargo and rats, making the illness spread exponentially. What made it worse was that those on board were asymptomatic for up to 5 days. Doesn't that sound like a horror movie plot? Number 10. The worst hit areas were mountainous and isolated. It's also amazing to know that the Black Death was worst in mountainous and isolated areas, particularly in Western European areas such as Snowdonia, Wales, and Florence, Italy. These areas were very underpopulated and had the highest mortality rates of 90%. They lost over 50% of their townspeople. Other areas in Europe were spared and had lower death rates of between 30 and 40%. It's theorized that since the mountains weren't as densely populated, the plague hit these small communities harder. Number 11. Plague patients were advised not to bathe. If the dung and urine used to treat their illness weren't gross enough, doctors of the 14th century also dissuaded plague patients from taking baths or even changing their clothes. This was believed to be a way of quelling God's wrath. Before you judge, remember that the people thought the plague was a form of punishment from the Almighty. They reasoned that any form of vanity was sinful, so to avoid displeasing God, they didn't wash up. Instead, people used perfume to cover their body odors. It sounds crazy, but it's true. Number 12. The name Black Death was not used during that time. It may be shocking to know that the term Black Death only came up after the pandemic. During the time, it was known as the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, or the Great Plague. The name Black Death came from a poet known as Simon de Corvinu through one of his works. He nicknamed the disease Atra Mors, which directly translates to terrible death or Black Death in English. The name stuck ever since. It's quite a befitting name if you ask me. Number 13. The Black Death set the foundation for the Renaissance. The effects of the Black Death pandemic were so devastating that many believe it prompted the birth of the Renaissance. Why? Because the dramatic population decrease and economic crisis may have triggered people to engage in more scientific and medical research. This mind shift and newfound creativity possibly helped lead the way to the Renaissance. I guess that's the silver lining around the dark cloud. Number 14. Quarantine was the most effective prevention method. Just like today's pandemic, villages and communities went into lockdown, quarantine, and even social distancing. In the Black Death era, policies were put in place to enforce the quarantine. For instance, in the Adriatic port city of Ragusa, all incoming ships needed to be quarantined before being screened to ensure the people on board were plague-free. Did history end up repeating itself? Anyway, this initiative didn't help much because Ragusa was a commerce hub and couldn't remain closed off from the world. Other cities like Venice and Milan also had similar legislation in place. It's also interesting to know that some people were smart enough to figure out that quarantining quelled the disease and voluntarily went into isolation. Number 15. The plague still exists today. Yeah, you heard me right. The Black Death still exists in today's modern times under the name Bubonic Plague. But before you get to worrying and prepping for a world calamity, know that another Black Death isn't likely to happen. The great developments that we've made with antibiotics make it highly unlikely that such a pandemic would take place again. Only developing countries have small outbreaks here and there. For example, the last known plague attack was in 1994 in India, so there's no need to worry. So, which fact was most shocking? Do you have any other exciting facts about the Black Death that you think we should have included? Let us know down below in the comment section. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other content on this channel and subscribe.